the Juneau World Affairs Council presents Depleted Uranium in Iraq, a summary of public health impacts and controversy, with Shelby Surdyk. Surdyk studied the topic while living in Beirut, Lebanon, for her master's thesis in environmental health. Surdyk grew up in Skagway and has been active around nuclear issues since high school.
Is it a boy or a girl? Usually, this is the first question that a mother asks after giving birth. But according to doctors from the Ibn Ghazan Obstetrics Hospital in Basra, Iraq, this is no longer the case. Instead, mothers ask, is it normal? Beginning in the mid-1990s, medical doctors in southern Iraq began observing unusually high rates of congenital birth defects in areas of Iraq that had been heavily bombarded during the first Gulf War. And those doctors suspected that the cause of the birth defects was exposure to a toxic, radioactive heavy metal that is used in some bullets, tanks, and tank penetrators by the US military, called depleted uranium. Hello, once again, my name is Shelby Surdyk, and thank you to everyone who's here tonight. Thank you to the Juneau World Affairs Council for inviting me to speak and for sponsoring this talk. It's a huge honor to be here, and I feel really blessed to have this opportunity to share with you what I've learned over the last 3 years about the impacts of depleted uranium on public health in Iraq. And what I'll present today is actually a piece of the findings from my master's thesis research, which was titled A Systematic Review of the Associations Between Exposure to Weaponized Uranium and Adverse Health Outcomes Among the Iraqi Population. That's a mouthful, and I thought it was a little too long-winded of a title for tonight's presentation, which is why I parsed it down. Also, I'm not at liberty to share with you all of the findings from my thesis because my advisors and some of my colleagues and I have submitted some of our findings to a journal for publication. It's currently under review, our manuscript. And so I can share with you some of the findings, but you'll have to stay tuned for the full article. I completed my master's degree in environmental sciences with a concentration in environmental health at the American University of Beirut, and defended my thesis almost exactly 1 year ago today, in January of 2019. But my interest in environmental health, and specifically in the health impacts of radiation exposure, began way before that, in high school actually. And this is a photo of my 16-year-old self interviewing the author Beverly Keever. She's the author of News Zero, The New York Times and the Bomb. And this photo was taken in Honolulu, Hawaii. You can see in the background my friend Erica Harris, who was filming the interview. Erica and I, while high school students, created a theater piece called Students Educating for Nuclear Awareness. And this piece told the story of the US nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands. Between 1946 and 1958, the US conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. And during that time period, the US military carried out a human radiation experiment called Project 4.1, during which they purposely exposed Marshallese people to fallout from Castle Bravo, which was the largest atmospheric nuclear test that the US ever conducted. And I'm sorry that this photo is so grainy, but what you're looking at is the image of a Marshallese woman holding a sign with her assigned subject test number. It says wrong, number 39, wrong standing for Rongelap, and it shows severe radiation burns on her face and neck. My friend Erica and I started performing this theater piece in Alaska in 2006. And somehow, people in the Marshall Islands heard about it and they invited us to visit the country and perform it there. And after a year of bake sales and raffles and odd jobs, we had fundraised enough money to get there. And there we are in the Marshall Islands. Unfortunately, on this day, Erica and I wore matching outfits. But this photo was taken on the island of Ibai in the Kwajalein Atoll with our theater coaches, Jacqueline Ashwell and Kent Fielding. Kent Fielding had taught in the Marshall Islands on Ibai before coming to teach in Skagway, Alaska, which was my hometown. And our theater project was a direct result of his coaching and mentorship and guidance, as well as Jacqueline. They were really great theater coaches. And speaking of great theater coaches, the Juneau High School Drama Debates and Forensics team and the coaches Ashley Snooks and Jamie Marks are hosting the Alaska State Drama Debate and Forensics Tournament here in Juneau next month, February 13th to 15th, and they're still recruiting volunteer judges. So if you'd like to get involved, please come and speak with me after this presentation. But back to the Marshall Islands. While we were there, we had the opportunity to meet with a woman named Lijan Eknalong. And Lijan was 6 years old the year that Castle Bravo, the nuclear test, was conducted. And she was one of the subjects that was recruited without her consent into Project 4.1. So she was treated essentially as a human guinea pig. 1 year after Erica and I visited the Marshall Islands, Lijan came to Juneau, and she spoke at the World Nuclear Awareness Conference that was organized at UAS in 2008. And while she was at UAS, Lijan spoke about the impacts that exposure to radiation had had on her body and how she was never able to have children of her own. She talked about how 7 times she gave birth to babies without limbs, without bones, with translucent skin, babies that were born dead or didn't survive. In the Marshall Islands, these are called jellyfish babies or bomb babies. And one day while Erica and I were rehearsing our theater piece, we decided to Google jellyfish baby because we wanted to see and we wanted to comprehend what women in the Marshall Islands were experiencing. So, we typed into our computer, jellyfish baby, and the images that emerged on our screen, the sad, horrible images, were not from the Marshall Islands. They were from Iraq. And that was the moment that I became aware of depleted uranium. So fast forward, as an undergraduate at UAF, I remained interested in nuclear issues. I volunteered at UAF's gamma ray spectroscopy lab, which after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident in 2011, tested marine mammal tissues from Alaska for Fukushima-derived radionuclides. And I got to help with that, and it was an extremely meaningful and rewarding period of my life. As an undergraduate, I was also interested in political science, and I studied Arabic. And one summer, I won a scholarship to study Arabic in Tunisia. And after that, I decided that I wanted to study or go to graduate school in an Arabic-speaking country and continue to do nuclear stuff. And then in 2016, I won a scholarship to study environmental health at the American University of Beirut in Beirut, Lebanon. And AUB is an incredibly beautiful and an incredible institution located on the Mediterranean coast, which is not a bad change from Alaska. It's, as I said, it's a really great institution. To give you some figures, last year, AUB had 1,200 faculty, 8,000 undergraduates, 1,600 graduate students, and was ranked as the top university in the Arab world. The Faculty of Health Sciences, which was my faculty, is accredited through the U.S. Council on Public Health, or CEF, and it's the only CEEP-accredited institution in the Arab world. And it has some really great professors, including my own committee members, who were Dr. Rima Habib. She was my advisor and the chair of the Department of Environmental Health. She's also an expert in the health impacts of low-dose radiation exposure. Dr. Eli Ael, who is a guru on my thesis methodology, the systematic review. Dr. Omar Dawashi, another brilliant mind, is an Iraqi medical doctor and anthropologist and author of the book Ungovernable Life, Mandatory Medicine and Statecraft in Iraq, which I highly recommend. Our central research question was, is environmental exposure to weaponized uranium associated with adverse patient-important health outcomes among the Iraqi population? And now I'll explain how we tried to answer that question following this standard scientific format. In the background, I'll talk about the properties of depleted uranium as well as its mechanism of toxicity. And in the methods, I'll tell you more about what a systematic review is and why we chose that as our method to answer our research question. As you probably know, uranium is a naturally occurring radioactive heavy metal. It has an atomic number of 92, so 92 protons, and it has an atomic weight of 238, which tells you that it has a really big nucleus. And the forces that hold nuclei together are weak. So uranium nuclei have a tendency to break apart in a process called decay. That process releases energy, and that energy is radioactivity. We normally talk about 3 types of radioactive energy: gamma rays, beta rays, and alpha radiation. Uranium typically emits alpha radiation when it decays. And that is the most powerful form of radiation, but it's also the least penetrating. It can't travel very far in the air, so in order to cause biological damage, it has to be internalized. In nature, uranium exists in 3 isotopic forms, and 238, which is the longest-lived isotope, has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, which means that it's very unlikely to decay. But when it does decay, it goes through 17 progeny, including the isotope 234, the uranium isotope 234. Isotopes 235 and 234 are less abundant, but they have shorter half-lives and higher specific activities, so they contribute more overall to the radioactivity of natural uranium. So you can see here, 234 makes up only 0.005% of all natural uranium, but it emits almost 50% of the radioactivity. Of these 3 isotopes, only 235 is fissionable, meaning that in order to manufacture fuel for nuclear weapons or nuclear energy fuel, the concentration of 235 isotopes has to be increased. That process is called enrichment, and it produces a waste product that has less 235, fewer 235 isotopes. So it's depleted of 235, and that's what we call depleted uranium, or DU. Depleted uranium is 40% less radioactive than natural uranium because it has fewer of the isotopes 235 and 234. It's also one of the heaviest and densest materials known to man. And in its metallic form, it's not just radioactive, it's also highly reactive, chemically reactive. In fact, it's pyrophoric. And that means that when exposed to air, the metal will spontaneously combust, forming uranium oxide aerosols. For all of those reasons, as well as its abundance and its low price, the US military began experimenting with depleted uranium in conventional weapons in the 1970s and used them in combat for the first time in Iraq during the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War began on August 2nd, 1990, when the Iraqi military invaded Kuwait. In response, an international military coalition was created, led by the US. Over the short 5-month war, more than 90,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Iraq, and that devastated Iraq's infrastructure, including its highways, hospitals, water treatment facilities, sewage treatment facilities. The international response also included the imposition of economic sanctions by the United Nations Security Council. These were the most comprehensive and the harshest economic sanctions that have been imposed by the Security Council on any country. And they remained in place long after the first Gulf War. Some of the sanctions weren't lifted until 2010. The sanctions, combined with the destruction of Iraq's infrastructure, devastated Iraq's public health. And among all of the bullets that were fired and all of the bombs that were dropped on Iraq during the first Gulf War, some contained depleted uranium. The US reports that at least 350 tons of depleted uranium were used in Iraq between 1990 and 1991. And during that time, DU was used only in southern Iraq, in the governorate of Basra and near the borders of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. During the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, the US and coalition forces again used depleted uranium munitions. But in this case, the US hasn't reported a figure concerning the total amount of DU that's been used. But some DU firing coordinates have been obtained by George Washington University and by the Dutch peace organization PAX because they filed a Freedom of Information Act request. So what these DU firing coordinates show is that DU has now been used across Iraq, not just in the southern governorate, but in almost every governorate in the country. The International Atomic Energy Agency estimates that as much as 1,700 metric tons of depleted uranium could have been used in Iraq since 2003. That's a lot of DU. But DU is definitely not the only toxic remnant of war that people in Iraq could be exposed to. And it's not the only factor that could contribute to adverse public health outcomes during or after conflict. So what is so concerning about DU specifically? What's specifically concerning about its toxicity? And how could exposure to weaponized uranium lead to adverse health impacts decades after the weaponized uranium has been used? Well, I'll tell you. When depleted uranium munitions hit a hard target like an armored tank, they create uranium oxide aerosols, which can remain suspended in air, or they can be dispersed in the wind. They can settle on the ground or be resuspended by the wind. And eventually, they get inhaled, and that's where the uranium becomes internalized. Once uranium enters the lungs, it can be absorbed into the bloodstream in the alveolar region of the lungs, either via diffusion or phagocytosis. Also, some uranium oxides are water soluble. So when they settle on the ground, they can be dissolved in water, enter watersheds, and then enter the body via ingestion. After being internalized into the bloodstream, uranium oxides are metabolized to urinal ions, which can readily bond with other molecules like proteins and then be circulated through the body via systemic circulation. Most of the uranium that is absorbed into the bloodstream is excreted in urine within 24 hours. But the small amount that remains, about 10%, is stored in the bones, in the kidneys, and in the liver. It's also capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier and the placental barrier. Animal experiments and laboratory petri dish studies have shown that uranium is capable of all sorts of terrible things at the cellular level. Animal experiments have also shown that exposure to uranium can induce carcinogenic and teratogenetic effects. So for those reasons, internalized uranium, whether enriched, natural, or depleted, is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, as a Group 1 carcinogen. So that's a general summary of the properties of depleted uranium and its toxicity. And given that well-documented toxicity, when doctors in Iraq began seeing increasing rates of birth defects in places that had been subject to heavy military bombardment, when they started seeing birth defects and cancer, they had a strong suspicion that depleted uranium was the cause. But in public health, suspicion is not enough. It's not enough to influence policymakers. It's not enough to fund medical interventions, and it's often not enough to persuade other academics. And so for 2 decades, research was conducted, and media and the academic literature raged with debate and controversy over this topic. And one of the most controversial events in this debate occurred in 2013, when the Iraqi Ministry of Health published a summary report of a national household congenital birth defects study that they'd conducted in 2011 with funding and support from the World Health Organization. The study found that Iraq had not experienced any increase in birth defects since the first Gulf War, and it denied finding any link between DU exposure and birth defects. Well, the academic literature responded and harshly criticized that study. They said it hadn't undergone peer review, its methods were questionable, and the World Health Organization was accused by a major cover-up, including by former administrators in the United Nations. So there was this big controversy, there was lots of debate, the media was really hyped, and then silence. The IMOH never published a full report from that study, and the data was never made available to independent researchers for analysis or verification. And then public attention on the issue faded. And that's kind of the trend with DU research. There's these waves of attention and controversy, and then silence, and then more research. And when I started this research project, I thought, surely enough research has been conducted. Like, surely enough data and evidence exists to show that there is an association between DU exposure and adverse health outcomes, including birth defects and cancer in southern Iraq. I was certain. I just thought maybe some of the research has been covered up. Maybe it hasn't been synthesized. Maybe Iraqi researchers are only publishing in Arabic in Iraqi journals, and so their findings aren't available to a wider scientific audience. So I sat down with my advisor and I told her all of this, and she said, Shelby, you have to do a systematic review. And I was like, systematic review? What's that? Well, a systematic review it's a literature review. It's a fancy literature review, but it's very big, and it's very meticulous, and it's very specific. And it is secondary data analysis. And in clinical medicine, systematic reviews are considered the highest tier of evidence. And that's because they have a rigorous, transparent methodology. They have transparent, reproducible search strategies. They have pre-specified, pre-published screening protocols that buffer the review against bias. And they engage a team of reviewers and researchers who conduct screening independently so that they can act as quality check and quality assurance against each other. But before we could conduct a systematic review on this topic, we needed to be absolutely certain that no one else had ever conducted a systematic review on this topic before. So we contacted a medical librarian, and she helped us check. And when we were doing that check, we learned that over 30 review articles, so articles summarizing primary research, 30 review articles had been published on this topic since 2003. But only one of those reviews had been conducted systematically, and it only looked at the impact of depleted uranium on US Gulf War veterans, not on the Iraqi civilian population. In fact, almost all of these review articles focused on Gulf War veterans, not Iraqi people. So we realized that this kind of study hadn't been conducted before. There was a gap in the literature, and we launched a project to try and fill that gap. And when I rehearsed this presentation a couple of days ago with my friend Rich Moniak, he almost fell asleep during the methodology section of the presentation. So rather than explaining to you every step in the systematic review process, I'm just going to tell you that there are a lot of steps involving a team of researchers. And if you'd like to read the whole methodology, it's published on Prospero, which is the International Registry for Systematic Reviews. So that's available online, published, and you can read it. And if you have any questions, I'm here in Juneau. You know how to find me. I will say briefly that using a systematic review method, our goal was to capture the overlap of every study ever published on uranium and every study ever published on Iraq. So we were trying to find that overlap and then screen the articles to get our final set of included studies that met our inclusion criteria. And then we would assess their quality and try to synthesize the data. So we implemented our search strategy in 11 databases. We captured 3,105 records, so those are articles, studies. We screened them, and after the screening process, we were left with 26 articles, but some of those articles reported the results of multiple studies. So there could be an article that publishes results from a study in Fallujah and a study in Basra, and they're published in the same article. And so we had a final set of 31 studies, which was more than any other review paper on this topic had identified before. We found way more studies than we expected, actually. We were kind of thinking like maybe we'd find 10, and 31 was huge. This map shows the geographic scope of our included studies. So you can see pretty well distributed across Iraq. Their publication dates ranged from 1999 to 2017. And there were 6 health outcome categories that these studies focused on. They were congenital birth defects, cancer, other birth outcomes like infant mortality, immune system function, BCL2 oncogene expression, and mixed outcomes. And this is not very systematic of me, but I'm just going to highlight the findings from 2 of those health outcome categories, birth defects and cancer. Okay, so 10 of our included studies looked at congenital birth defects as their health outcome of interest. And of those, 4 specifically looked at birth defect incidence. So they were looking at changes in the rate of birth defects among a population in a given region before and after the region had been contaminated with depleted uranium. And all 4 of those studies found higher rates of birth defects after contamination. And one of those studies found that between 1994 and 2003, the rate of birth defects in Basra had increased by 17 times. The other 6 birth defect studies were studies that directly measured uranium concentration in human biological samples that were collected from parents who had given birth to babies with birth defects and healthy controls. And then they compared the mean uranium concentrations between those 2 cases and controls. And, 5 of those 6 studies found higher mean uranium concentrations among cases compared to controls. 12 of our included studies looked at various types of cancer as their health outcome of interest. Of those, 7 looked at cancer incidence. I should say 1 also looked at cancer case counts. And of the 7 that looked at incidence, only 2 found higher incidence among their exposed populations compared to their unexposed populations. In contrast, in the cancer case control studies that again used or measured uranium concentration in human biological samples, all 4 found higher concentrations among cancer patients compared to healthy controls. I should say, though, that across our body of evidence, there was a very high risk of bias. Typically, studies didn't account for important confounders. They didn't account for other factors that could influence rates of cancer or birth defects. For example, with birth defect studies, a good study ought to account for maternal age, ought to account for consanguinity, which is the tendency to marry close relatives. It should count for maternal folate deficiency, and possibly it should account for exposures to other teratogens like lead in leaded gasoline. So those were some of the elements that led to a high risk of bias across our body of evidence, but 81% of our included studies, 25 out of 31 across all outcomes, found an association between uranium exposure and adverse health outcomes. So that seems pretty condemning. The body of evidence was very consistent in the findings of direction of effect, but we also found that high risk of bias. So we concluded, and this is like a very technical way that this is worded, and I'm not allowed to say it differently. Although the data suggests that there is an association between uranium exposure and adverse health outcomes in Iraq, the evidence is very uncertain. And that, while it's a relevant contribution to the literature, feels a little bit anticlimactic to me. We didn't find the condemning evidence that I thought we would, mainly because of the high risk of bias across the body of evidence. Some of the strengths of our study was the sensitivity of our search strategy. Like I said, we captured more primary studies that any review article had before. And we didn't limit our search by language of publication. So hopefully, some of the studies that we found that were originally published in Arabic or only in the Iraqi Scientific Journal database, hopefully they get now wider readership and attention. One of the big weaknesses of our study is that we didn't engage stakeholders, and that's usually a really important thing in public health. I never went to Iraq. I never worked directly with Iraqi researchers, many of whom have committed their lives to trying to answer this question. The TV didn't pick up that question, but you can ask it at the end. Going forward, more high-quality primary research on this topic is needed, such as a large-scale human observational study on the scale of the Iraqi Ministry of Health birth defect study or Les Roberts' mass mortality study in Iraq. Supplementing that research, the Iraqi Ministry of Health should release the full report from its 2011 study, and the US Department of Defense should release a complete set of DU firing coordinates so that epidemiologists can have access to that data for their research. And even as research continues, I think there's enough evidence to justify a ban of depleted uranium weapons. Such a ban, modeled off of the treaty to ban landmines or the treaty to ban cluster munitions, has already been proposed. And not just proposed, but last year, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in favor of a resolution that outlined a ban of uranium weapons. Even with progress like that, after 8 months of working on this systematic review, I was feeling pretty agitated about how unengaged academia can feel. I felt like, okay, I did some academic research, and now it's time to do some activism. And just as I was wrapping up my thesis, I found out about an Alaska Fellows Program position here in Juneau, working with Veterans for Peace, doing advocacy on nuclear issues. And so I applied for that, and that is what brought me back to Alaska from Beirut. And now, as I'm wrapping up my presentation, I have to give a plug for the project that Veterans for Peace and I am working on now, which is called Point Hope, Alaska's Youth Congress for the Global Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. This event will be held in Sitka from April 6th to 10th this spring, and up to 40 high school students will be accepted to attend. Our student application is open right now on our website, and it'll remain open until Friday, January 24th. If you'd like to learn more about the event or find out ways you can get involved, you can visit our website, which is akhopecongress.org. And I know that there are many Veterans for Peace members in the audience, but for those of you that aren't, there's a sign-up sheet right outside the door, and you can be added to Veterans for Peace's listserv, and there's some brochures about the project. So with that, thank you very much, and any questions?
We do have a few minutes for questions. I'll get us going. If you have one in mind already, go ahead and line up. Do you happen to know which armies in the world currently still use depleted uranium?
So I believe there's 6 countries in the world that are thought to have DU weapons, and they're all also nuclear weapon armed states. So France, UK, China, Pakistan. Yeah.
Kind of a convenient way to shoot your garbage away.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis. I've wondered myself whether or not DU weapons were just a way to get rid of like leftover uranium after the enrichment process. But it seems like the amount that's used in DU weapons is a very small fraction of the total amount of depleted uranium that's produced by nuclear states for nuclear weapons or nuclear fuel.
And from the standpoint of military personnel who are going to want, I guess, maximum penetration when they're shooting at armored vehicles, is there anything comparable to this that only kills the people it's supposed to that's out there? Is that a potential solution?
Yeah, and actually, in just the last few months, the US military has announced that it might begin transitioning out of using depleted uranium weapons because of the comparable functionality of tungsten. Tungsten is also a heavy metal. I mean, like, war is bad, and like I don't want to say like necessarily one weapon's better than the other, but the US military is considering weaning out depleted uranium from its arsenal.
Thank you, Shelby. John Dunker. Back a ways in your presentation, you talked about the basic association you were examining between exposure and the incidence of birth defects. And then you mentioned the confounding factors that might lead to bias. And of course, that makes a study subject to a lot of criticism, and necessarily, right? But does one of your recommendations then suggest that there be a study into the association, not just between the incidents, the timing, and the geographic locality and all that, and the outcomes, the health outcomes, but between actual exposure, which I would think would require tissue samples and that sort of thing in the affected population. Did you uncover data of that sort so that there could be another study that would examine that association, or was that incorporated into your study?
So great question, thank you. So two parts of the question, I think. One, did we capture any studies that used a case control method or directly measured uranium concentration in human samples in people from Iraq? And yes, many of our captured studies use different techniques, ICP-MS or CR39 track detectors, to measure uranium concentration in different types of tissues. But even studies like that could potentially have problems with confounding variables. Only one of those direct measurement studies, I guess I'll call them, assessed the isotopic ratio of the uranium that they were detecting. And without measuring the isotopic ratio, you don't know if it's from a natural source or from the environment before depleted uranium weapons were used in an area, or if it's from artificial uranium, or specifically from US depleted uranium weapons. In order to build a body of evidence to prove causality in environmental health, there's no one study design that can cover all of your bases and establish causality. And even causality is kind of like a metaphysical concept. But in public health, there are 9 criteria that are considered essential for establishing causality, from contaminant to effect. And those 9 criteria are called the Bradford-Hill criteria, and they include things like dose response. So if you're exposed more to a contaminant, do you have a bigger response? Or does that make sense? The effect should come after the exposure. If you remove the exposure, like reversibility, does the effect go away? So there's no study design that can meet all of those criteria. But many studies together can create a body of evidence that establishes causality. Did that answer your question? Kind of. Definitely more research is needed, and a big household survey is needed. It would be even better if it was supplemented by more direct measurements.
Hi. Can you speak at all about the cleanup that would be involved? Thank you.
So it's a tricky question, because when Iraq was under economic sanctions, it limited the import of many valuable materials like metal, necessary for construction and all sorts of things. So contaminated areas in Iraq aren't well documented, and there's been a lot of dispersal of contaminated materials as tanks that are armored with depleted uranium or have been destroyed by depleted uranium munitions have been moved all over the country to different metal scrap yards and then repurposed for other materials. So it's really a big mess. Cleanup efforts have been made. There's a radiation protection center in Basra that has documented some of the cleanup efforts that have been carried out by the Iraqi government. And there are some centralized tank yards where tanks have started to be collected, but I don't know offhand what the cost would be for a comprehensive cleanup given contamination to that level. I bet the data's out there, so I'll look it up and try to get back to you.
Excuse me. Are there other places in the world other than Iraq where there has been established a relationship between depleted uranium and public health effects?
So first, depleted uranium has been used in places other than Iraq. It was used during the Balkan Wars, so Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Those are all countries that also have been contaminated with depleted uranium. And just like there are studies in Iraq that have claimed to have found an association between uranium exposure and health outcomes, so too there are studies from those countries that claim to have found an association between uranium exposure and health outcomes. And also among veteran populations, among US veterans, among veterans from the UK, and other countries. And there has not been a systematic review looking at all of that data. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. There's also other places where it's been suspected but not confirmed that depleted uranium has been used. There's a big debate over whether depleted uranium has been used in Afghanistan, and the research behind that is pretty controversial. A debate over whether or not depleted uranium was used in Lebanon, where I was studying and going to school. It's thought that it was used in southern Lebanon by the Israeli military, but again, the data is really controversial.
Shelby, I'm just wondering about your youth summit in Sitka, whether there'll be proceedings coming out of that that'll be available to the public, or it'd be nice to be able to share that with a wider audience.
Thank you. Great question. And I should clarify that the Youth Summit is about nuclear weapons, and depleted uranium weapons are not nuclear weapons. They're conventional, meaning they don't undergo nuclear chain reactions, just to clarify that. But to answer your question, yes, parts of the Youth Congress will be public and open to anyone to observe and attend. The way that the conference is designed is that students will be in workshops in the morning, and those workshops, they'll be working on projects. They'll be doing project-based learning that will also produce outcomes that will be presented publicly. But the public is not open to attending the workshops. But afternoon seminars, when guest speakers will be present in Sitka, those will be open to the public to attend. And we do have plans in place to document those events, to film them and try to make them available to a wider audience.
Are there specific manufacturers of depleted uranium ammunition?
Good question. Like, who are the really bad guys? I don't know. That's a good question.
So we don't know where they're coming from? Nations are just acquiring them, or?
No, so I don't know if it's private contractors that are producing the depleted uranium weapons, or if it's the US military. That's a great question. And there are layers to this research project, and I feel like I'm just going like deeper and deeper, and it's just one piece of this larger global military industrial complex.
And how many perfect, well-designed studies would be necessary to add to the 31 that you have that do find a connection be necessary to reach a different conclusion than the carefully worded one you have already?
Right, that's a great question. I don't know, but this is a question I'm going to take back to my advisors and see what they think, because they have a lot more experience in public health and designing public health research, which other than this I haven't done before.
Sounds great. We'll have you back in a year. We're running out of time. Are there any more questions? No? With that, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
That was Shelby Surdyk in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded January 16, 2020 at KTOO in Juneau, with support from AEL&P, Poor Alaska Kensington Mine, Haight and Associates, See Alaska, the University of Alaska Southeast, and Wastman and Associates.